The war between Ukraine and Russia has turned into a prolonged conflict. Realistically, it looks like we're staring down another year or two before this finally comes to an end. As the situation drags on, more and more people are asking the same burning question. What would have happened if they had just kept their nukes? But here's the thing, Ukraine wasn't naive. They wanted those weapons more than anyone else. The truth is, they simply didn't have a choice. Let's dig into the real story behind Ukraine's nuclear disarmament, right here on Flat Archive. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine effectively became the world's third largest nuclear power overnight. We're talking about more than 1,700 nuclear warheads. Now, to be clear, Ukraine didn't build these weapons. They didn't have the launch codes or even the tech to maintain them. They were essentially just left behind when the massive Soviet military machine fell apart. And it wasn't just Ukraine. Other former Soviet states like Kazakhstan and Belarus also suddenly found themselves sitting on a nuclear stockpile, almost like winning a terrifying lottery. Kazakhstan ended up with 1,400 warheads, and Belarus with about 80. See, the Soviets didn't keep all their eggs in one basket. They deliberately dispersed their warheads and launchers across different regions to survive a preemptive strike. Ukraine and Belarus were right on NATO's doorstep, the perfect front line for shortening missile flight times and striking fast. Kazakhstan, on the other hand, was tucked away in Central Asia, serving as the rear base and testing ground. The Soviets assumed the Union would last forever. It never even crossed their minds that stationing nukes in these republics could be dangerous one day. But Ukraine was special. It was the crown jewel of Soviet nuclear power. While Kazakhstan had test sites and Belarus had tactical nukes, Ukraine inherited the whole package: ICBMs, strategic bombers, underground silos, and even the command networks. They had a fully operational nuclear triad. These weren't just weapons gathering dust in a warehouse. They were locked, loaded, and ready for combat at a moment's notice. For a newly independent nation, that kind of power was incredibly tempting. To Ukraine, these weren't just weapons. They were the ultimate insurance policy to guarantee their freedom. That is exactly why, unlike Kazakhstan and Belarus, who gave up their nukes relatively quickly, Ukraine clung to them. They didn't want to let go until the very last moment. For Kazakhstan, the reason for rushing denuclearization was painfully obvious. The Semipalatinsk test site in the east was practically the beating heart of the entire Soviet nuclear program. We are talking about 456 nuclear tests conducted right there. That's more than half of all the tests the Soviet Union ever ran. The fallout was devastating. Hundreds of thousands of locals were exposed to radiation, leading to a massive spike in cancers, birth defects, and genetic disorders. Because of this, a deep-seated hatred for nuclear weapons had already taken root in their society. As a new nation, if they wanted Western investment and aid, they had no choice but to ditch the nukes. It was the only way to avoid unnecessary conflict with Russia and rebuild their economy. Then there was Belarus. They didn't really have a reason to hold on to them either. Aside from lacking the tech to actually use the weapons, they were politically very pro-Russia anyway. So they decided early on that it was basically a no-brainer. Give up the nukes and cash in on economic support from both Russia and the West. But Ukraine. Ukraine was a different story. Throughout the Soviet era, they were under Russia's thumb. They were called a brother nation, but in reality, It was a relationship of domination and submission. The Holodomor, the Great Famine of 1932 and 33, is the darkest symbol of this pain. The Soviet government forcibly seized grain, starving millions of people to death. For Ukrainians, Russia wasn't a protector. They were a direct threat to their very survival. Even during World War II, Ukraine became a brutal battleground between East and West, claiming countless civilian lives. After the war, industrialization brought waves of Russian migrants. This is why the Russian language and culture took such deep roots in places like the Donbass and Crimea. Crimea, in particular, was a ticking bomb time. It was originally Russian territory, but in 1954, Soviet Premier Khrushchev handed it over to Ukraine. It was technically an administrative move, but it was also influenced by Khrushchev's own personal political history in Ukraine. At the time, the Soviet leadership saw it as just a redrawing of internal borders. They never imagined that this gift would plant the seeds for a major territorial conflict decades later. Because of this traumatic history, Ukraine couldn't shake the fear that Russia might intervene again, even after independence. That's why nuclear weapons weren't just assets to them. They were seen as the ultimate deterrent, the only thing guaranteeing their true freedom. In fact, the Ukrainian parliament passed several bills declaring that they must never give up their nukes. Many politicians argued that a nuclear-free Ukraine would be left completely defenseless against Russia. But the country was torn. One side argued there is no independence without nukes, while the other countered, keeping them will only isolate us from the world. Caught between harsh reality and political ideals, Ukraine spent years in a state of chaotic indecision. But ultimately, the decision to fold wasn't just political. It was practical. The harsh reality was that these weapons were effectively useless. Moscow held the launch codes. The scientists and engineers who knew how to run the systems, they mostly packed up and went back to Russia. Ukraine was left holding the hardware, but without the software or the brain power to use it. It was a classic empty shell scenario. Here's the kicker. Even if you can't fire them, you still have to pay for them. Nuclear warheads aren't like bullets you just store in a box. They degrade. They need constant reprocessing. Missile engines need servicing. Silos and launch vehicles need 24/7 maintenance. Then you add the security costs, preventing theft, high-tech surveillance, training new scientists, radiation shielding, pollution monitoring. The bill just keeps stacking up. To give you some context, the US spends about $50 to $60 billion a year maintaining its arsenal. That averages out to roughly $17 million per warhead per year. For Ukraine to maintain its 1,700 strategic warheads plus tactical nukes, they were looking at a price tag of billions of dollars annually. We're talking about 10 to 20% of the entire national budget of a brand new, struggling country. And no, having nukes doesn't mean you can skimp on your regular army. You still need tanks, jets, ammo, and soldiers. In fact, being a nuclear state usually makes your neighbors more nervous, forcing you to spend even more on conventional defense to match their heightened readiness. It's the nuclear paradox. Instead of saving money on security, you end up spending way more. Just look at Pakistan or North Korea. They poured everything into the bomb, often at the cost of their conventional forces and their wider economy. The gap between the weapon they wanted and the weapon they could actually afford was just too wide to bridge. This wasn't something a newly independent nation could just handle. They weren't facing a recession. They were staring into the abyss of a total economic collapse, a complete system failure. From 1991 to 1995, Ukraine's GDP plummeted by over 60%. Let me put that in perspective for you. During the Great Depression in the US, the economy shrank by about 30%. Ukraine's crash was double that of the Great Depression. And inflation, it was catastrophic. In 1993 alone, inflation hit over 10,000%. We are talking about hyperinflation, where the paycheck you get today turns into worthless toilet paper by tomorrow morning. People's life savings evaporated overnight. Paying bills became impossible. In some regions, 80 to 90% of the population couldn't afford to pay for gas to heat their homes. Entire cities lost their central heating. Thousands of people literally froze to death inside their own apartments during the brutal winters. Hospitals went dark, power outages became the norm, and for a while, surgeons couldn't even operate. When the government paralyzed, the vultures swooped in. The mafia and black marketeers took over the streets. Loan sharks were everywhere. You had to go to the black market and pay triple the price just to find basic necessities like bread and sugar. Civil servants stopped getting paid. The prime minister changed multiple times a year. The political system was a revolving door of chaos. The entire society was sliding into near anarchy. In just 3 or 4 years after independence, over 3 million people packed their bags and left the country in search of work. It was a mass exodus, a nation emptying out. In that kind of economic hellscape, holding on to nukes for some hypothetical war while starving today, that just wasn't on the table. It wasn't a luxury they could afford. But internal collapse was only half the problem. Ukraine was about to hit another wall, a rare unified front from the two superpowers, the United States and Russia, squeezing them from both sides. Even if the weapons weren't operational yet, their mere existence was a nightmare. For Washington and Moscow, the idea of an unstable, brand new nation sitting on thousands of nukes was terrifying. They were petrified it would trigger a nuclear domino effect, encouraging other nations to arm themselves. So, the superpowers didn't care if Ukraine could launch them. The fact that they had them was dangerous enough. The threats started flying. In 1992, a senior U.S. official laid it out. You keep the nukes, you get zero help from the IMF. Then, Defense Secretary William Perry took it a step further, effectively threatening to treat Ukraine like a pariah state, putting them in the same category as North Korea or Libya if they refused to disarm. Russia was even more blunt. They were terrified of Ukraine becoming a second Soviet Union. So they went for the jugular: energy. Since Ukraine relied on Russia for nearly 80% of its gas, Moscow simply threatened to turn off the tap and strangle their economy. The message from both East and West was crystal clear: give up the nukes or you won't survive as an independent nation. Of course, there were voices calling to hold the line, to keep the weapons no matter what. But squeezed between internal collapse and external pressure, the hardliners lost. Pragmatism had to win. President Kravchuk and the leadership came to a painful realization. Giving up the nukes wasn't surrender. At that moment, it was the only way to save the country. But it begs the question, what if they had refused? What if they kept the nukes? Sure, the deterrent would have been real. The fear of a nuclear strike might have changed Putin's calculus entirely. Maybe the annexation of Crimea in 2014 or the full-scale invasion of 2022 would have never happened. A nuclear-armed Ukraine wouldn't have needed NATO. They might have stood alone as a truly independent power, demanding respect without needing a security umbrella. But there is a darker timeline. If they had clung to those weapons, the West would have cut them off completely. No IMF loans, no World Bank aid. The economic hell of the 90s wouldn't have ended, it would have deepened. And that broken economic system, it would likely be continuing to this very day. And Russia? They wouldn't have just watched. If Ukraine tried to pivot west while holding on to nukes, Moscow likely would have launched a preemptive strike right then in the mid-90s before Ukraine could crack the launch codes and actually use them. In fact, archives from the Ukrainian Foreign Ministry contain a chilling assessment from that time. If we don't disarm, Russia will intervene militarily, install a puppet regime, and the West will just stand by and watch. That was their true nightmare scenario. So, in 1994, the deal was done. Ukraine signed the Budapest Memorandum. In exchange for giving up the third-largest nuclear arsenal in the world, they received security assurances from the US, the UK, and Russia, promising to respect their borders. In return, the doors opened. They got the bailouts, foreign investment, trade deals, and full recognition as a normal member of the international community, from the UN to the Olympics. They traded their weapons for a future. Unfortunately, promises are cheap. As we all know, the guarantee didn't last. Crimea was annexed, and the full-scale invasion followed. The Budapest Memorandum turned into nothing more than a worthless scrap of paper. But here is the hard question. Is Ukraine suffering simply because they gave up their nukes? If we look at this coldly, the truth is that war was likely coming for them, nukes or not. Look at the geography. Crimea was a gift from Russia that they always wanted back. Donbass was a region dominated by ethnic Russians and an identity crisis. These weren't just territories, they were ticking bombs waiting to go off. It wasn't a matter of if Russia would make a move, but when. And Russia played a very cunning game. They started handing out Russian passports in Crimea and Donbass like candy. They blatantly ignored Ukraine's ban on dual citizenship, systematically undermining the Ukrainian identity of the people living there. It was a calculated move to destabilize the country from the inside. Experts saw the writing on the wall. They warned for years that war was on the horizon. But for decades, Ukraine chose to hit the snooze button and ignore the warnings. Instead of preparing for defense, the military was left to rot. Reforms stalled. Modernization was a joke. Meanwhile, the oligarchs, those super-rich tycoons who snatched up state assets for pennies, hijacked the economy. They bought the political parties, the media, and even the courts. It was total state capture. The country was torn in two, pro-Russia in the east, pro-West in the west. Internal unity was non-existent. The public was so sick of the corruption that they elected a comedian, Zelensky, as president just to smash the system. It was a total mess. That was the reality of Ukraine right before the first tank rolled in. Look, choosing survival over nukes back in '94 was the rational choice at the time. No one disputes that. The real problem is what happened after. They had economic aid, they had security assurances, they sat on the most fertile soil in the world, they had a golden opportunity to build a powerhouse nation, and they squandered it. Instead, they failed to build a functioning state and made the fatal mistake of waging a war they couldn't sustain alone, relying entirely on outside help. Ultimately, Ukraine wasted 30 precious years. 3 decades lost to political infighting, corruption, incompetence, and a total failure to unite their own people. The failure to stop Crimea in 2014 and the catastrophe of 2022, the root cause wasn't the lack of nukes. It was those lost 30 years. Watching them fight a war today that depends entirely on foreign lifelines is tragic, but it's the inevitable price of failing to build a strong foundation when they had the chance.